Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
In this episode, we thought we'd talk about not a series of events or a particular event like we sometimes do, but an institution. And an institution which, not that long ago, you could barely put on the news without hearing of it. Had its chairman been into Number 10 to try and dislodge the Prime Minister? Had somebody written in another letter to the chairman to try and do the same? What were the rules that it would decide for electing a new Prime Minister, and so on and so on? These were, within the last decades, issues that were almost perennially discussed and debated about the role of the 1922 committee. So in this episode, we thought we'd look at what that committee is and how it became quite so powerful in British politics.
So I think to start us off, Lee, we might as well just explore the basic question. What is the 1922 committee? Is it synonymous with all Conservative parliamentarians, both in the Commons and Lords? That is the way in which, say, the equivalent body in Labour, the Parliamentary Labour Party, is set up. It's the body of all of the Commons and Lords members of Parliament for the Labour Party. In other political systems, the word that's sometimes used is a caucus, the House Democratic Caucus or the Senate Republican Caucus in the United States. So is that what we're talking about here, or are we talking about something slightly different from that?
Well, if I can begin by giving a slightly unsatisfactory answer. What the 1922 committee is, well, that depends upon when in history you're asking about. But what it pretty much always is a tool for party management within the Conservative Party. So if we just strip this right back to fundamentals for a moment, of course, all democratic countries have political parties. Those political parties compete for election either to win by majority or in coalition with others. Within those parties, there are internal hierarchies, usually from the sole leader at the top, although occasionally parties will have multiple leaders, right down to voters who support that party at the very bottom. And within that hierarchy, you will have people who have elected to Parliament, people who are councillors, people who work in the party professionally, people who are members, and like you say, at the very bottom, you'll have supporters. And what has to happen generally is that the leaders of those parties have to find different ways to manage the party elements that sit beneath them. And in the United Kingdom, one of those groups that needs managing within a party is the Parliamentary Party, the people who sit as members of Parliament, particularly in the House of Commons, and on whom party leaders depend for the confidence and authority that they need, and ultimately, of course, on whom a government depends in order to pass legislation and maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. So at its most basic, the 1922 committee is a part of the institutional framework of the Conservative Party that helps with the management of members of Parliament and the relationship between MPs and the party leader. The ways in which it can do that, however, have changed quite a bit over time. So in this podcast, we'll talk about some of its early foundations. But if we look at now what the 1922 committee is, it basically functions as a trade union. This term trade union is quite often used to describe it, usually with quite a tongue-in-cheek way, given it's a feature of the Conservative Party, not the Labour Party. But it's basically the union for backbench Conservative MPs, i.e. those who are not the leader or are not members of the cabinet or ministers. So it's really there as a vehicle to represent the rank and file members of Parliament within the Conservative Party and to facilitate, in part, their relationship with the party leadership. But there are nuances to that, which I'm sure we'll come to and unpack in this episode.
Yes, I mean, just for example, there are roughly 100 members of the front bench in Parliament on the government side, and the official opposition typically shadows most, if not all, of those positions. And given that there are 116 Conservative MPs at the time of recording, based on defections and so on, that means that pretty much all Conservative MPs, except a handful who are well, I don't want to be unkind, but have ruled themselves out or have otherwise been ruled out from a shadow ministerial role are on the sort of proverbial shadow front bench. So, presumably, when you're in opposition, the shape of the 1922 committee is a bit different than when you're in government.
Yes, it's definitely true that it does serve a different function in government compared to opposition. We'll come on to talk about the ways in which its membership has fluctuated over the years. But when the Conservative Party is in opposition, everybody is a member of the 1922 committee except for the leader. So it basically, at that stage, serves the same purpose as the Parliamentary Labour Party does in Labour. It's when it's in government that it much more importantly becomes the voice and the vehicle for backbenchers over the payroll vote, as you would think of it, over those who are members of the cabinet or ministers who are basically compelled to support the prime minister and the government in what they do. So its role does change, and that's partly a factor of how the 1922 committee has evolved throughout its now more than a century of history.
Right, and that's quite interesting because that analogy or metaphor that's used about trade unions, you can sort of see how that operates then in government, where the payroll vote, the ministers are the management, company management, and the backbenchers are the workhorses, are the workers. And the role of the 1922 committee is to represent the workers in an organization to management, even though they're within the same corporate structure, shall we say. Okay, so that gives us a sense of what this entity is. It has a rather curious name, and Parliamentary Labour Party is pretty straightforward. It says what it is on the tin, the House Democratic Caucus. You can guess what that is. 1922 committee. It sounds like some kind of obscure commemoration committee that you might have if you were honouring some kind of event. So what are its origins, and why does it have this rather peculiar name?
So I love the name 1922 committee as it happens, because I think it shows how this institution is brilliantly conservative with a small c. And that is to say that it was established to meet a purpose. That purpose has evolved to meet the demands of politics at the time. And it has maintained, in part, the institutional framework, but certainly the name of its history. So you can see its lineage in its name, as opposed to, like you say, something which is purely descriptive, like the Parliamentary Labour Party. To look at its foundations, I think we should start by dismissing two myths about the 1922 committee. The first is quite easy to do. People often imagine that it was founded in 1922 and the year celebrates its birth. Well, it was founded in 1923, so it's not a product of that. And the second, which is really quite common, is the myth that it relates to the October 1922 meeting of Conservative MPs at the Carlton Club. That's something where, even though it's slightly beyond the remit of this podcast, that's something we could discuss in the future. But it's basically when the Conservatives are in government, propping up David Lloyd George as Prime Minister. So the Conservatives are keeping a Liberal in number 10. The leader of the Conservatives at the time, Austin Chamberlain, is pretty happy with this arrangement and wants to carry it on. There are grumblings among Conservative MPs, including some senior and emergent MPs like Stanley Baldwin, who want to see that relationship ended and an independent Conservative Party without Lloyd George forming a government. They meet at the Carlton Club. There's a vote. MPs vote to break up the coalition. It is seen as this moment of backbench, rank and file rebellion against Austin Chamberlain and his leadership. He resigns leadership. David Lloyd George resigns as Prime Minister. There's a general election. The Conservatives win and Andrew Bonar-Law becomes Prime Minister. That happens in October of 1922. And it looms so large in Conservative history. It's one of the great events in Conservative history that people often assume that that must be, in part, a causal factor behind the creation of the committee, or maybe it was even named in its honour. The only way in which it's at all causal is that when the general election comes at the end of 1922, the Conservatives win that general election handsomely. There are 111 new Conservative MPs who make it into the House of Commons. And it is they who decide to set up the 1922 committee, and they name it after the election and their year of election, which took them into Parliament.
Well, you say this is straying beyond the remit of our podcast, although it's become increasingly clear, as one of our listeners mentioned, that this is really more of a podcast about British political history since the First World War rather than the Second World War, even though the name is Attlee and Churchill. Although I think since Bonar Law and John Robert Clines is slightly less catchy than since Attlee and Churchill, and it's probably a bit too late to change the name now anyway. Just tell us a bit more then about, after this 1922 election, why there then is this formation of the 1922 committee.
Well, for the new Conservative MPs who get elected in 22, they feel, as generations of MPs before and since have felt, totally disoriented by the process of getting elected and becoming a member of Parliament. This is something you do still hear MPs talk about today, how you get your note from the returning officer, I think it is, who's declared you the victor, that you turn up on the next working day, often the Monday afterwards, to the Palace of Westminster. They let you in. You have to find the appropriate whip and the people from the party hierarchy who are there to try and shepherd you in, find an office, understand what an early day motion is. There are a myriad, particular, often quite confusing ways that the House of Commons works that MPs have to navigate when they first get elected. And so the 111 new intake MPs for the Conservatives in 1922 decided that they would form their own little support group, basically, that they would navigate this journey of being a new MP together, that they would share information that they got, that they would find somebody who they could ask who's a bit more experienced, and then pass that advice on around. This was interestingly reported in the Times when the group was set up early in 1923. And the Times said that these MPs were, I think by their own admission, dismayed at their ignorance of parliamentary practice and procedure. So we should really think of the 1922 committee and its origins as basically being a support group for novice Conservative MPs.
So it's really to import a bit of an awful American term, it's the class of 1922 that gives the name to the 1922 committee.
Exactly that.
And therefore, by its nature, they're very likely all to be backbenchers because they are newly elected MPs from the 1922 election.
Yes, and what's actually amazing, I think, and what's really surprising is that the 1922 committee survives at all, given this. So the early 1920s are, for reasons we've occasionally discussed, pretty tumultuous years in British politics. There's another general election in 1923. There's another general election in 1924. And then there are new intakes, and then there's all this churn that's going on. Yet this committee manages to assert itself on the political map as an important institution. And this really happens because quite early on, the committee starts to develop additional functions that aren't just passing around tidbits of knowledge and information about how Parliament works. So, for example, there are little committees within this 1922 committee, subcommittees, that are looking at policy areas that they're particularly interested in. Of course, some huge debates are going on at this time around policy, most notably about protectionism and tariffs and imperial preference. And then shortly afterwards, in 1924, Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative leader, agrees to set up backbench policy committees to look at policy areas. And these, in effect, start to merge some of their functions. And the 1922 committee meetings sometimes become a way for policy committees more generally to report back to other MPs. And so within just a couple of years, really, its functions have begun to expand.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So you have 3 elections in 3 years, and the 1922 committee, or the class of 1922, is then supplanted or augmented by the class of 1923, and you could have a 1923 committee, but it's probably a bit useless to have that because there's so many novice MPs from 22, and then you put the 23 and 22 together, and then another group of novices coming in 24, but they're smaller than the other. So I can sort of see how it sort of you stumble into basically the 1922 committee absorbing the class of 23 and 24, and they just never got round to updating the name, basically.
Yes, so that is a very important point to make. So The 1922 committee doesn't feel it has to guard itself as simply the, to use the vulgar term you used, class of 22. It doesn't feel it just has to be that. It quite quickly expands its membership to other people who are newly elected, but then more broadly to other Conservative MPs as it adopts these other functions.
And so basically at this time, though, it's what I might call a kind of political education grouping, that its focus is on capacity building, information exchange, training. I mean, all these sort of, I don't want to use too many of these horrible HR kind of ideas and transplant them to the 1920s Conservative Party. That's sort of basically what it's doing at this time, isn't it? It's not a democratic body in the sense of a sort of internal party democracy vehicle.
That's entirely right. That idea of being a way for MPs to enrich their understanding of Parliament and of politics more broadly ends up becoming what sustains the 1922 committee throughout this period. There are moments where it is more significant as a feature of party management and understanding party opinion than others. But what it maintains throughout is this sense of having some sort of educational function, rather like you put it. And at times, that's a sign of its impotence, almost. So Stuart Ball, the historian of the Conservative Party, has said that there were moments when it risked just being a lecture club and really nothing more than that. Not necessarily a bad thing for MPs to have for what it's worth. I think there's something quite good about getting external experts and opinions into the minds of members of Parliament. And they had a huge range of people, from industrialists and scientists to Sir John Reith, the founder of the BBC, coming to address MPs via the 1922 committee. And I think that was all to the good. And that did mean that it remained a relevant organisation for some MPs in its early decades, even if not the essential institution of parliamentary party management that it would go on to become.
By virtue of being the organisation that brings together most of the Conservative backbench MPs, and by the late 1920s, it becomes effectively commensurate with the backbench Conservative MPs, it therefore must also gain a bit of a sense of utility, that it can be used as a vehicle for expressing the collective view of backbench Conservative MPs, or is it not realised as such?
I think collective view would be a bit strong, not least because, of course, it's very, very difficult to have a collective view among a large group such as backbench Conservative MPs. But certainly it becomes a means by which you can take the temperature of the party in Parliament and get a sense of, okay, which are the issues that are really frustrating people, that they've heard from their constituency officers or from the public that these issues are of great frustration to them, or where the government's proposing something or not proposing something that really wrangles with their inner judgment or their conscience. It became a way for those issues to manifest themselves collectively. And the founding chairman of the 1922 committee, who has a brilliant name, Sir Gervase Squire Chittick Rentoul, KC, who is in fact distantly related to the political journalist John Rentoul. He remarked in 1928 that the committee was useful, quote, as a means of ascertaining and representing rank and file opinion, and as a clearinghouse for information on the matters of common importance to members of our party. And I think that pretty much sums it up well. The caveat to that, or perhaps the context in which to put that purpose, is that there are moments when backbenchers are relatively strong versus a leader, and moments when they are relatively weak. And so, for example, when Stanley Baldwin loses elections, as he does at times in this period, it's possible for the remaining backbenchers to assert themselves a bit more strongly than when there are massive majorities. So one of the themes of the 1922 committee is it doesn't have a constant level of power or influence. It's actually fluctuating throughout its history. But by virtue of the fact it is a grouping of MPs on whom ultimately the party leader does depend, it means that party leaders and their supporters are increasingly looking to it as a way to judge what the mood in the party is. And it also means that the people who are members of it and the chairman and the executive committee of it see it as being a way to try and manifest and represent what the parliamentary party more broadly thinks.
And when would you say that it goes from being a lecture club with a bit of influence to really coming into its own and being seen as being able to actually represent something of the collective view of Conservative MPs?
Our first ever elections mini-series was on the Attlee versus Churchill elections, starting with 1945. And when we spoke about that election, the one that really heralds the beginning of the post-war era, about which we claim to but don't always strictly focus, we discussed the challenges of party identity and party organisation during the Second World War. Of course, most listeners will know this, but from 1940 onwards, we have a national government that lasts until pretty much the end of the war, lasts until early summer of 1945. You have the Conservatives and Labour working together. In 1942, Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, becomes Deputy Prime Minister to Churchill, the Conservative Prime Minister. And when by-elections happen in this time, typically speaking, the party who was last in post gets to put somebody up without them being contested by the other major parties, sometimes controversially, but that is because in the context of total war, party politics is basically suspended for the most part among the major parties. And to the extent that it's suspended, it is most of all suspended, if not totally abandoned, within the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party basically gives up huge amounts of its institutional framework and fabric and the people who work within it to basically just redirect its energies on issues more relevant to the war. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that really the 1922 committee and its meetings arguably become, and this is an argument that Lord Norton of Louth, the Conservative peer and academic, has made, the only authentic Conservative voice in politics during the war. That Churchill is acting as a national leader. The cabinet and senior ministers are part of a national government. The party, as a campaigning professional organisation, is basically moribund at this time. So it's the 1922 committee meetings of Conservative MPs that really take on this almost unique status at the time as being the voice for conservatism. And that's not to say, of course, that it was totally cut off from the matter of fighting the war or the fact there was a national government. Interestingly, as well as Conservative ministers addressing the 1922 committee at this time, a feature which develops, particularly in the Second World War, as a way of reporting back to parliamentary opinion about what the government is doing, why it's doing certain things, why certain jobs have been given to Labour or National Liberals rather than Conservatives, and how the whole war operation is working in Westminster. As well as Conservative ministers reporting on that, Labour ministers are too. So you get this remarkable thing where people like Clement Attlee goes and reports back to the 1922 committee of backbench Conservative MPs. It is said that when he did so, that he made a favourable impression, for what it's worth. It's also in the war where I think we can really start to see a bit of the 1922 committee asserting itself and its importance in relationship to the party leader, which is all the more remarkable because, of course, the leader at the time is Churchill, the great wartime premier. But, for example, Churchill was not delighted about the way in which ministers were increasingly expected to go and talk to and address the 1922 committee. And it is suggested that, in fact, he wanted ministers to stop doing this. But soundings were taken among MPs. The chief whip got feedback from people and met with the chairman of the 1922 committee. And ultimately, they decided it was becoming such an important forum that it was no longer an option for ministers to just skip it. And in fact, it was during this period when the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Private Secretary, Churchill's own PPS, began regularly attending 1922 committee meetings, because it was becoming that means by which the leader could, via their PPS, better understand what backbenchers were thinking. And this function, in fact, grew post-war, particularly when the Conservatives returned to office in 1951 for Churchill's peacetime government. And from 1952, for example, it was agreed that the whips, the people who were in charge of parliamentary discipline, would attend 1922 committee meetings as observers and would use it as a way in which they could understand then where's the potential rebellion? What are the issues that are coming down the track that we may not actually be able to command a parliamentary majority on? So I would say it's the war and those early post-war years that make it particularly important.
That period in the Second World War is so fascinating from the perspective of party politics. I mean, we talked about, as you said, Lee, from the perspective of the party grassroots in that special we did on the 1945 election, looking at that wartime truce. But actually, the role of the parliamentary parties in the Second World War is really interesting. You've spoken just now about the way in which the Conservative backbenchers, the 1922 committee, effectively becomes the Conservative Party for the country during the war in absence of the grassroots. And in many respects, the Parliamentary Labour Party functions in a similar, if not the same fashion. We have a chapter in the book that I wrote with Gavin Hyman and Mark Garnett, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Party in Opposition since 1922, which looks specifically at Labour during the war, because although it was a wartime coalition government where you had the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, a Conservative, and Clement Attlee, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was the Labour Party leader. In fact, at that time, the Labour Party was still the official opposition to the government that had Labour ministers in it. And at that time, you had a man who was the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, Hastings Lee Smith, who, in his capacity as chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, took over from Attlee and became leader of the opposition at the start of that wartime coalition government. So it's I hadn't known a great deal about the importance of the 1922 committee until you were talking about it just now in the war, but it's interesting seeing the mirror images going on there. We associate today the 1922 committee most keenly with Conservative leadership elections, the subject of, and I'll plug your book, Coronations and Defenestrations, which is coming out very soon on the history of Conservative leadership elections. 1965 is the year in which the Conservative Party has its first formal leadership election. But before that, there is this process of emergence when Conservative leaders are discovered, in a sense. What role, if any, does the 1922 committee have in that process of emergence? Because I think often when people think of that process, they think of what Ian MacLeod once called the magic circle, this notion it's a very closed circuit of the elite of the Conservative Party deciding between themselves and the palace who should become the Conservative leader and or prime minister. Is that quite right? Or is there something or is there some role for the 1922 committee in this emergence process?
Well, the process of emergence isn't static. It's worth saying it evolves over time. Some of the ways in which it evolves are blatantly obvious. So in the Victorian era, the person who could emerge as Conservative leader and Prime Minister could be a member of the House of Lords. Into the 20th century, it's quite clear that they can't. There are other ways that it develops as well, which basically means that by the middle of the century, the views of Conservative MPs is more important in determining who can lead the party. Now, this is not yet a time when Conservative MPs are electing the leader themselves. That begins in 1965, and the 1922 committee will play an important role in that. That isn't happening in the early post-war years, when we have the transitions of power from Winston Churchill to Anthony Eden to Howard Macmillan, and Howard Macmillan to Alec Douglas-Home. They are happening through this process of emergence. But general perceptions of who MPs support do increasingly matter behind the scenes in shaping who it is that should become Conservative leader and Prime Minister. So you can see this period really, I think, as being a preamble to 1965 and formal leadership elections within the Conservative Party. And the best evidence for that really comes in 1956 to 1957. So, of course, in 1956, Britain gets involved in an appalling misadventure in Egypt over the access and ownership of the Suez Canal. We did a year or so ago do an episode on that, which would be available wherever you get your podcasts from. And this Suez crisis was basically the end of Anthony Eden's political career and also, for a time, it seemed, potentially his physical health. So there were extended period of time at the end of 1956 when Anthony Eden was out of the country. He, in fact, went to recover from the stresses and strains of Suez in Jamaica at the home of Ian Fleming, as it happens, the author of the James Bond novels. Rather a nice place to distract yourself from the challenges of governing back home. And it's during this time that two people, Harold Macmillan and Rab Butler, are basically tasked with providing an update on behalf of the government to the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs. And they go along to the meeting to do this briefing. And Rab Butler gives a perfectly ordinary, comprehensive, perfunctory review of where the government is at, what its upcoming priorities are, and its assessment of the situation. Next up to speak is Harold Macmillan, who, in one sense, gives an update as well, but actually delivers a leadership pitch. He's grand in the way he makes his arguments. He's engaging in the way that he speaks. He's talking about re-establishing the Conservative government on a secure foundation. He's talking about the future more compellingly of where the Conservatives can take the country. And he completely outfoxes Butler. And it's blatant to the people who are in the room that that's what's happening. It's an attempt to try and win MPs over to the idea that he should be Eden's replacement, many of whom expect Eden to be replaced fairly soon. Ultimately, he goes in January of 1957. And Macmillan does replace him. The interesting thing is he doesn't replace him because of the votes of any MPs who are in that room. They don't get a formal say on Macmillan or Butler or anybody else becoming leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. But that sense and perception within the party hierarchy in Buckingham Palace, as well as it happens among Conservative grandees, Churchill is consulted on who should replace Eden when the time comes. That sense of who do the MPs want? As John Morrison, who was the chairman of the 1922 committee at this time, said about a different leadership election, who do the chaps want? Or who will the chaps not have? Well, it gives away the gender makeup of the Conservative Parliamentary Party at the time. But those perceptions, whilst informal and never truly counted, really begin to matter in terms of who has the confidence of MPs to lead the party and form a government.
I think it's a very useful corrective to our understanding of emergence, where it goes deeper than I think it was made out by its critics in terms of its levels of consultation and the notions of consent for the leadership. And I know that that's a point that you make in your forthcoming book, Coronations and Defenestrations, which will be out soon. I had to put in another plug for you. It reminds me a little bit of years ago, I was on the governing body of an Oxford college just for a year, and the way in which decisions were made on that in that governing body very interesting. A topic would be discussed, and there would be differences of opinion voiced in the room, and then the warden of the college, the head of the college, would say, "Well, we've taken the temperature of the governing body on this issue. My sense is the balance of opinion in the room falls on this side of the question, so that is the decision that we will make." And I sort of used to sit there and think, gosh, it's no vote that's been taken. And someone did say to me, I don't know if this is true, that the notion of voting at governing body, at least at this particular college, would be seen as vulgar and needlessly divisive, I think was the term that was used. And so it was much better for the warden to just get a sense of what the decision of the room was, and that, in effect, that decision would emerge through discussion and deliberation. Even if there were dissenting voices, you didn't need to require that people put their dissent on paper in a ballot. You noted it, but you also noted where the balance of opinion. Of course, it gives an enormous amount of power to the person who's chairing the meeting, but in some ways, I think that's the closest I've ever sort of been to that process of emergence, which is not quite democratic in a procedural way that we see it, but is still more perhaps inclusive than people initially think. But let's fast forward now to 1965, when the Conservative Party, for the first time, has a process by which it elects a leader. This is the first time it really elects a leader through a vote of its MPs. This is a process that has been worked out under the leadership of Sir Alec Douglas-Home, whose selection as leader of the Conservative Party at the end of the Macmillan government was somewhat controversial and led to a formalization of an alternative process. So where does this 1922 committee fit in the new and first ever formal rules for electing a Conservative leader?
Well, when those rules come about, the 1922 committee is basically charged with administering the ballots and overseeing the process for the election. And that's a testament, really, to how it's grown in importance as a key institution for governing and managing the Conservative Party. It's at a meeting of the 1922 committee where Alec Douglas-Home says that he's resigning and triggering the process to have a leadership election itself. So it rather takes on this sense of being the entire vehicle for it, from the outgoing leader going to electing the new leader. Really, in 1965, I think you can see the chairman of the 1922 committee becoming the, yes, returning officer, but also really the linchpin in Conservative leadership elections.
And it's not just in the selection of Conservative leaders that we associate the 1922 committee, but perhaps even more so, we associate the 1922 committee with the removal of Conservative leaders. Tell us a little bit now about how the 1922 committee becomes the vehicle for expressing Conservative discontent with the leadership and becoming the vehicle for the removal of Conservative leaders.
Well, the Conservative leadership for most of its history has been a freehold rather than a leasehold, at least in practice. There were no obvious ways to get rid of a Conservative leader. You could do some blatant and embarrassing things. You could publicly call for them to go, but there was no confidence vote process, as would be the case today, for example. And so this rather means that, just as Rentoul, its first chairman, said in 1928 that it would provide an insight into backbench and parliamentary opinion, it means that that becomes really important in the event that MPs become disillusioned with the leadership they're getting. And that happens with the very first leader who MPs themselves elect, Edward Heath. So he becomes leader in 1965. And by late 1974, he has fought 4 general elections and lost 3 of them, including 2 in 1974 itself, in February and then in October. It's no great surprise that a record of only 1 out of 4 is seen as pretty subpar for a Conservative leader, after all, the party that dominates British politics in the 20th century. And so there are a growing number of MPs who want Heath gone, who think the party has got to try something else. And it's via the 1922 committee that that message tries to reach Edward Heath. So shortly after the October election, the 1922 committee's executive, they are the people elected by the backbenchers in order to be the steering committee, in effect, the key figures in the 1922 committee. They meet and are unanimous in their view that Heath should go. They ask their chairman, who at the time was a man called Edward Ducan, to meet Heath and to tell him that they think he should go. Heath is, I think it's fair to say, not very receptive to that response. He totally dismisses it, in fact, out of hand. He's not interested in surrendering the reins of power now. And so you basically get stalemate at this stage. And what becomes a really interesting feature of it is the way in which the stalemate gets broken is, because there's been a general election and there's a new parliament, the executive of the 1922 committee are about to be elected afresh. And 2 rival slates form, a Heathite slate and an anti-Heath slate. And that vote basically becomes a proxy for a confidence vote on Edward Heath's leadership. Not to the extent that if it's lost, he will resign, but to the extent that that is signalling, really, what MPs think about whether Edward Heath should go or not. And the anti-Heath slate wins. The Heathites are routed in that. And then Heath at that stage decides that the leadership rules need to be updated to find a formal mechanism to test the confidence of the leader. So there's lots more detail on that we could go into. We have done some episodes about it, especially about how Margaret Thatcher became leader in 1975 and defeats and removes Ted Heath. But the key point to make about it, I think, is that when there were no rules for how to remove a leader, but there was tremendous discontent with the way Ted Heath was leading the party, the 1922 committee and its internal elections become the means by which the views of the parliamentary party can be known. Its status is established and sanctified, really, as an essential feature of the Conservative Party.
Right. I think it's really important to understand that in 1965, the 1922 committee is formally given the role in electing the Conservative leader, but there is no way of ejecting the Conservative leader through the 1922 committee, at least formally, but informally, it assumes that purpose. And then after the rules are changed with the departure of Edward Heath, where now MPs can remove the Tory leader, the vehicle is the 1922 committee, but that's initially limited to just one time a year.
Yes, that's right. So in 1975, the way in which the rules change is to enable annual leadership elections in the Conservative Party, which can be challenges to the incumbent. But there's no distinct process for it. It's just to have a fresh leadership election. There are windows when that can be done, either after the new Parliament meets after a general election, or in the weeks after the Queen's speech, when the new parliamentary session opens. And again, the 1922 committee is the key to the way that works. For example, the timeline for when nominations have to get in, when ballots would take place if there were to be an election, is decided usually between the leader and the chairman of the 1922 committee. Nominations, were they to be received, go into the chairman of the 1922 committee. If there's a ballot, it's administered by the 1922 committee. So at that stage, the role in electing the leader basically gets extended to the exact same function, really, of overseeing a leadership election, but also applied to potentially removing leaders as well. And this is how not only Edward Heath goes in 75, but how there's a challenge to Margaret Thatcher in 89, how she falls in 1990, and also how there's a challenge to John Major in 1995.
But what I think really gives the 1922 committee the profound power that we have come to understand that it has in deciding the fates of Conservative leaders comes after the Conservatives changed their leadership election rules in 1998, ostensibly to weaken the role of MPs in leadership selections. But I would argue that in part, at least at the early stages, at least at the stage of ejection of the leader, these rules empower the MPs more because they take away that fixed term annual election process and now make the fate of the leadership based on the sufferance of just 15% of Conservative MPs. So can you explain this? What I'm talking about here is the infamous letters process of the 1922 committee. So perhaps can you explain what that process is for our listeners who may not be as familiar with it, and why does it come in when it does?
Yes, so in 1998, the Conservative Party decides to partially enfranchise its membership to determine who leads the party. And one of the consequences of this is that it's no longer possible to just have annual leadership elections as a possible means of testing the confidence of a leader. Partly because the process for electing a leader is now so long and arduous, because it involves hundreds of thousands of members all over the country, and also because there is an alternative argument, which is that whether a leader stays or goes should not necessarily be down to the grassroots, but should be down to members of parliament, because in a parliamentary democracy, they are the people who give the government and in turn the prime minister or party leader confidence. So as all of the rules change around electing the leader, it's recognized that the rules for removing a leader need to change as well. And that's when it's agreed that there will be a confidence vote system, pretty straightforward, really, that to decide whether or not MPs support a leader remaining in post or not, they would vote to keep or to ditch them, and a simple majority voting to get rid of them would be enough to end their leadership. That ballot, like other ballots by this stage, would be overseen and administered by the 1922 committee. But the crucial thing, and this is really where the power and the significance and the salience in recent years has been key, is, like you say, it takes 15% of MPs writing to the chairman of the 1922 committee to trigger that confidence vote. So 15% is roughly 1 in 6. It's not all that many people deciding they want to see the back of somebody to get this vote. When the 1922 committee has been in the papers or in the media a lot in recent years, it's been about this letter writing process and trying to meet the 15% threshold. It happened back in 2003 with Ian Duncan Smith's leadership, where there's a long and slightly comedic process of lots of MPs calling for him to go, but nobody actually having written a letter. And then there were forged letters. And then there were absurd scenarios of MPs trying to give the then chairman of the 22 committee secretary a letter stuffed inside of a magazine at the entrance to Westminster Tube Station because they don't want anybody to see them. I mean, the whole thing becomes sort of farcical the first time it's being done. On that occasion, the threshold is met and Ian Duncan Smith is removed. A big build-up of letters and pressure by this letter-writing system then happens twice more under the leadership of Theresa May and under the leadership of Boris Johnson, both of whom suffer confidence votes. And throughout this time, you do really see the enormous power wielded by the chairman of the 1922 committee. For both of those leaders, for May and Johnson, it was a man called Graham Brady. He was the MP for Altrincham and Sale West. He'd been chairman of the 22 since 2010. Hugely experienced in that role. Generally very well respected, I would say, among backbench MPs, seen as somebody who would stand up for their interests. I think generally as well guided the process with a high degree of discretion. People would doubt that since, as he's published a book, Kingmaker, about a lot of this, but he was certainly very discreet about the letter writing process. People did not generally know how many letters were in. In fact, people just did not know how many letters were in, to my knowledge, except for him. And the giveaway to that was usually when there were reports in the newspapers that the threshold was crossed or about to be crossed. It usually ended up not being the case. But an enormous amount of political attention, particularly in the years 2017 to 2019, and then really 2021 to 2022, was focused on how many letters are in. How stuffed is the mailbag of the chairman of the 1922 committee? And we found ourselves in a situation where the chairman of the 1922 committee, the leader of what at one stage was a self-help group for novice MPs just around a century ago, almost has the ability to make or break prime ministers. It's a remarkable evolution and growth of power for what originally was a very modest organization.
I should say that I think it's absolutely absurd the way that the chairman of the 1922 committee has all of this concentrated power. I don't understand why you can't have a system where if you are submitting a letter, it has to be seen by both the chairman and one of the vice chairmen of the 1922 committee. Because the way that the system works at the moment is that the chairman of the 1922 committee can simply make up numbers, and there is no way to verify whether he has made up those numbers or not. So at various points, and I know you interviewed him for your book, and your view is that he didn't make up things. But I sort of wonder when there were points that were tough for the governments and it would have been inconvenient to have a leadership election, what was stopping Graham Brady, even if the threshold was crossed, from claiming that it wasn't crossed? And what that meant is that the survival of a prime minister was totally in the unchecked and unverified hands of this chairman. Now, I'm not someone who is overly obsessed with legalistic rules and so on. I believe in a political constitution and I believe that you check power through politics. But this is an area where there is no political check either. I mean, no one really knows. No one really has a way of addressing this really profound power that the chairman has. I mean, you can't hold the chairman really to account for it because you don't know whether it happened or not. I think as a baseline that if someone is going to put in a letter, which in itself I think is a pretty problematic way of removing a leader. I think it should be someone publicly declaring that the leader should go, as is the case in the Labour Party. Then, if that's going to happen, the chairman must show the letter to at least one other member of the committee. Or do you disagree?
I do disagree. Whilst it's true, as you say, that they have a huge amount of power and discretion, and that power, like pretty much all power, could be abused. The key thing for me really is that the chairman of the 1922 committee is an elected position among the members of the committee, of backbench Conservative MPs. And so when they elect, and they re-elected time and time again, Graham Brady, they're expressing their confidence in him. Yes, to be their shop steward in that trade union sense of the committee, but also to be somebody that they trust to administer these processes. And could that trust theoretically be abused? Is it possible that secretly it has been abused? Of course. But I don't see any evidence personally.
So you said a moment ago, Lee, that the 1922 committee has undergone this profound transformation from a self-help club for MPs elected in 1922 to a kind of political education society to a de facto voice of the Conservative Party in Parliament to a body that elected leaders to a body now that can eject leaders with great alacrity. Looking at where the 1922 committee is today, do you see it as a force for good within the Conservative Party, or do you think that perhaps it needs its wings clipped a bit?
Well, if it didn't exist, something would have to be invented to replace it. You know, parties need a vehicle for making these decisions about their own internal affairs. And so long as MPs have an important voice in that, then it will certainly be the case. What makes it really interesting, I think, as a point of contrast with the way in which Labour works, is this focus on backbenchers. And of this being, particularly when the party is in government, the voice of backbench opinion. I mean, my understanding of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the PLP, is that all Labour MPs are members of it. And on occasions when that votes, all Labour MPs can vote. That's not the case in the Conservative Party. There have been attempts in the past to change that, it's worth saying. So back in 2010, David Cameron sought to change the membership of the 22 to include all Conservative MPs and basically make it a mirror image of the Parliamentary Labour Party. In order to do that, he called a meeting of all Conservative MPs. He put to them the question that the 1922 should be all of them, not just those on the backbenches. He won that vote, 168 to 118. However, doubts about the legitimacy of that process. It wasn't itself a meeting of the 1922 that decided it. It was just an all MPs meeting called by the leader, were expressed really quite quickly, and particularly by Bill Cash, Sir Bill Cash, the long-standing MP for Stone in Staffordshire, and really a Tory grandee by any definition. And Cameron ultimately withdrew the proposal, in spite of it seemingly having the support of a majority of MPs, but not necessarily a majority of backbenchers. So this question of its membership does stand it out as being rather different to what might replace it, or what would have been the case if the party just sat down one day and thought, well, how do we manage our parliamentary affairs? But I think if I take it back to some of the comments I made about the name, the way it's evolved and the way it exists today does show some of the best features of the Tory tradition, the way in which it was born out of function, evolved to meet changing needs, for example, around leadership elections or removing leaders, and then the way it became established through practice in the minds of MPs, leaders, members of the Conservatives more broadly, and all people who observe and think about British politics. Really to the point that it's impossible to imagine the Conservative Party without it.
And what of the future? We hear much less of the 1922 committee now than certainly we did in those heady days of the end of Theresa May, and then the end of Boris Johnson, and then the end of Liz Truss, and then the speculated end of Rishi Sunak. Has the 1922 committee, post Graham Brady, learned to quiet down a bit?
It's interesting you say post Graham Brady, because some people have thought in the past. So Alan Clark wrote this in his diaries once, in fact. Alan Clark, the Conservative MP and celebrated diarist. He said that the chairmanship and the effectiveness of the chairmanship was, quote, dependent upon the personality and force of character of the incumbent. And I can see the argument for that, but really I think what gives the 1922 committee power or not, or strengthens or weakens its relative power, is just the political context in which it operates. And I think that's always been the case. So to take us right back to the beginning, when there were massive Conservative majorities in the House of Commons at some points in the 1920s and 30s, not especially powerful. When Baldwin's leadership was on the ropes, it was able to assert itself rather more. More recently, when prime ministers have been in great trouble, let's take even before the risk of a confidence vote in Theresa May really emerged. When she lost the Conservative majority at the 2017 election, that makes it massively more important than it would have been in the past because of the parliamentary arithmetic. That's not a question of did it have a great chairman or not at the time. It's just a question of what's the political landscape in which the party is trying to operate. And we don't hear that much about it now. That's partly because, correctly in my view, the 1922 committee decided, before Kemi Badenoch was elected, that the threshold for triggering a confidence vote would go from 15% to 33%. And now it takes a third of MPs to trigger a ballot on the party leader. And that means that it's much less likely to happen now going forward. And if it were to happen, then I think it's basically game over already for the leader if a third of people have already written in against them. So I think that changes the dynamic slightly. But its relevance will spring up undoubtedly from time to time, and it will break through out of the parliamentary estate into the media and into people's minds, as and when times of crisis happen. And Sir Peter Bottomley, who was Father of the House in the last Parliament, once described the 1922 committee as effectively a blue light service, that it's there in times of crisis when you need it to help facilitate a resolution. And that is what I think it will remain.
Some might say it's the cause of the crisis, but we'll leave it there. We end this podcast, as we normally do, by talking about the books that we've been reading recently, and I'll go first. So I've recently read a book called The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump and Tony Schwartz. Obviously, this is a very famous book. It's the book that helped to make Donald Trump a famous name across the United States. It was, as Trump is very keen to remind people, on the New York Times bestseller list for something like, it was at number one for like 48 weeks. And it's funny in a way, as someone who the sort of other half of my life has spent researching and writing and teaching about US politics, and as someone who's done lots of commentary on the Trump presidency, I've never actually got round to reading The Art of the Deal until a few friends decided that we would read it together. And just a few observations about it. So first of all, this is very much a book of its time. It comes out in 1987, and it feels very much a book of the 1980s. It feels very much a book of the heady days of big corporate swagger and big business tycoons and Wall Street running rampant. And of course, you've got the big boom in the city of London. And Trump is a figure in all of that. The second thing that comes out of it is actually how Trump has a very keen sense of pride in place. So he's very, as I suppose you might as a property developer, has a very keen eye on where property is being developed or what property is being developed. But just to give a couple of quick examples. So he talks about how important it is that when someone enters New York City coming into Grand Central Station, that they see a thriving and bustling city of great landmarks rather than closed down grand hotels of a former age. Or he talks about how awful it would be for Manhattan to lose NBC to New Jersey. And so there's a sort of sense of like pride in place, which is quite interesting that comes out of it. Another element of it is Trump is obsessed with people and making observations about people and about relationships. I mean, it seems to me that, at least the way that this book presents it, Trump literally just would spend all day on the telephone talking to people. That was work for him, is he was just ring through with different people talking about different things, whether that was different business opportunities, whether that was about regulation or court cases, whether that was about charity work, whether that was about talking to other rich and famous people. And he is just a massive schmoozer. And in a way, that seems to be the bread and butter of his business. In one sense, it's a very unattractive figure. I mean, the sort of high swagger and instrumentalization of relationships in it is very off-putting. On the other hand, there is something you can see where people see a certain allure to Trump, because there is a tremendous confidence that he exudes and a tremendous sort of can-do sense about him, which I think makes him, in this book in particular, a particularly American figure, but actually I would also say a particularly New York figure, which I suppose over time we've come to see him less of as he's become associated with Mar-a-Lago and Florida. But I still think that ultimately Trump is someone who is not only a creature that can be only made in America, but quite possibly can only come out of New York City. Lee, what is your book this week?
Well, this week I wanted to talk about the 1922 Committee, Power Behind the Scenes by Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth. This is a book which, as you may imagine, I referred back to in preparation for this podcast. And it's a book I read a few years ago when it first came out with Manchester University Press. I think it is a superb book. There have been other histories of the 1922 Committee in the past, but they were decades old by the time Lord Norton took to writing this one. He breaks it down into three parts. First of all, he looks at the history of it, then how it is organized and how it is led, and then at the impact that it has had. It's tremendously readable. I often use the term readable to describe books that I like, and it sounds like it's faint praise, but so often you can open and begin to read a book and think, this isn't readable. Sometimes you just think, oh, if I'm to finish this book, it's going to be a slog. And invariably, in my case, I don't finish books where I think that I'm getting less out of them than I'm putting into them. This is not one of those books. It is incredibly well written. It's incredibly well researched, as people would expect from Philip Norton. And it really covers all the essential bases of the history and the importance of the 1922 Committee. I very strongly recommend it to you if you want to find out more about the theme of this podcast. We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this week's episode. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, please do leave a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. It cheers us up no end when we see the number of reviews ticking up, so long as they're good reviews. Obviously, there are exceptions. And of course, if you want to hear more from us, you can join our Patreon. There's a link in the show notes, and there are bonus episodes there. Episodes as varied as the 1955 general election, an interview with one half of the official biographer of Willie Whitelaw, and most recently, an episode about the personal faith and religious life of Margaret Thatcher and Gordon Brown. If we don't see you there, we'll be back on Thursday with our next midweek Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.